Hi there. I wanted to come online to do a fairly impromptu recording about something that's been on my heart lately. And that is something I don't think we talk enough about is how we often isolate our leaders. We create these positions or we put people into positions of leadership, and then we don't surround them with the right supports. We actually create an environment of isolation for a leader. We expect them to have a certain amount of confidence, authority, and some emotional distancing. That's kind of what we expect in our leaders because we want them to be strong and capable and smart and all of those things, but we don't necessarily give them the community of support. We don't give them the resources to help them navigate this new situation. And that can result in leaders who become kind of dissociated and checked out emotionally, but also quite authoritarian and I think in many ways often quite toxic in how they lead. And I'd share a little bit about the story for myself. When I first became a leader in my early 30s, I was promoted into a fairly high level director position in government, in the federal government. And things changed almost overnight. I remember this fairly dramatically that I had been surrounded by a fairly large group of friends that were peers. I'd worked in the organization quite a long time and then got promoted into leadership. And all of a sudden, I didn't have the same access to this peer group. There was no longer that peer relationship because they saw me as somebody who had moved out. I'd kind of abandoned their group in a sense to become a leader. And so I no longer got invited to the coffee get-togethers or lunches or those kinds of things. And it wasn't that they were doing it in a mean-spirited way. It was just I sensed that there was some assumption that they thought I'd now moved into a different peer group, that I was now having those relationships with a different level of people in the organization. But that wasn't really happening at the leadership level to the same degree. People had become more isolated, and it feels like the higher you move up in the hierarchy, the more and more you isolate. It becomes kind of that pyramid where you become more and more lonely in that the situation. And I remember really feeling that. I was still fairly young. I was a new mom at the time too, so I was feeling kind of lonely and in learning to navigate these two situations. And yet there weren't really natural supports built into the system. I was expected, like I say, to have authority and confidence. And I, in some ways, feel like I kind of learned to dissociate a little bit from my feelings. In fact, I remember at a leadership meeting where we were all sitting around, we'd been together in this intense 2 day meeting to make these really tough decisions about some budget cuts we were making and having to lay off some of our staff because there were significant budget cuts happening. And at the end of the meeting, I looked around and I could sense this real intensity of emotion in the room. And we were just going to leave the room and nobody was going to talk about that part of the experience. And I said to the regional director general, my boss, I said, don't you think we should maybe go around the room and just check in with how people are feeling? And I was met with kind of this wall in the room. And one of the managers, one of my peers, turned to me and said, feelings have nothing to do with management. And I think he said it kind of sardonically, a bit of a sense of humor, but it shut everything down in the room. Nobody talked about how they were feeling. We all went out of that room, had to go back to our staff and communicate some really difficult messages about how some of them were losing their jobs, and nobody had equipped us for that emotionally. And that's pretty typical when you're in leadership, is that nobody's equipping you to deal with that situation. And we're more and more getting thrust into situations of complex emotional change, disruption, liminality, and to use the language that's quite familiar for me, and not equipping people to navigate this and leaving them isolated and alone. And this is one of the reasons this has been on my heart for a long time now. You know, it's been almost 30 years since I was first becoming a leader, and there's part of my heart that's still back there wanting to tend those leaders who are isolated and not being supported in having to navigate that. And so that's one of the reasons that Krista, my business partner, and I have created a program called Leadership for Liminal Spaces. And we want to gather people and not only give them resources and ideas and learning around things like leading in liminal spaces and emotional intelligence and social intelligence and how to help soothe people's nervous systems and soothe your own nervous systems in those situations. But we also want to build a network around this and help people find other people who are also leaders because I remember really like searching around in the dark kind of for other leaders who wanted to talk about this, who might open this door. And I couldn't find it. I really searched and I even tried to gather some friends and there were one or two that would meet me for lunch, but it was like nobody wanted to talk about this at the time. And so I want to crack that open and I want to talk about it and I want to gather people together to help resource them in that. So I hope you'll join us for Leadership for Liminal Spaces. We've got 10 webinars throughout 2025. And then after each webinar, we've got a study group where people will meet weekly on Zoom and we'll unpack the topics on a deeper level. And we'll have times of sharing and storytelling and connecting. And so we want to create the environment really that I was searching for 30 years when I became 30 years ago when I became a leader. So Leadership for Liminal Spaces, find out more at Center for Holding Space / Leadership for Liminal Spaces.